doesn't, oh, there it is. There you go. Okay. So, hi, I'm Tim Foss. I was asked by the Parks Board to look at the Parks for All project and respond the way I do as a visual graphic recorder. So, graphic recording is distilling information visually. Usually, this is done on the fly. Usually, it's done in person in conferences or meetings. But of course, in this virtual moment, working virtually is what I was presented with. That's the challenge. And we discovered this Miro board, M-I-R-O, as you see up here in the corner, and it's probably a reference to Juan Miro, the famous artist. And the concept is to be able to push and pull ideas around. And it's kind of extraordinary how much you can do. It's a massive kind of infinite space. So I've created one frame within that infinite space, and I kind of want to walk you through where it started. The Parks Board had asked at one point just if people would engage with it. And so based on the initial survey they did and the ways people were responding were by looking at connections between things that people were saying in the committees or on their own in listening sessions. They're looking for gaps, and so you see how people are interacting here with these virtual post-its. They're also looking for significance, like what feels significant, what doesn't. And the hope for me was to essentially get to a place where I was able to identify what was significant and what wasn't myself. But what ended up happening was kind of more fascinating, was I couldn't figure out all the connections or all the gaps or all the signifiers. And it had a lot to do with the fact that I felt like it was all connected. That doesn't mean there aren't things that are really significant or things that aren't missing, but there's no way to look at it any other way than somehow everything affects everything else. Where I started, though, was looking at the emerging futures, which is something you may be familiar with. The Parks for All project identified that we're looking at a future that's going to include a more diverse city, an aging infrastructure, fewer wild plants and animals, an older population, a sustained increase in increased wealth gap, a denser city, a wetter city, a more technologically reliant population, and then this kind of emerging health crisis. And you see the way I dabbled. This was kind of even me just getting the hang of how this board worked. I dabbled with the ideas of diversity here by visually representing them and many dots of color leading off into a sort of infinite space. Infrastructure aging, playing with geometry, thinking abstractly about what is infrastructure. But as we get into things like wild animals, there is a concept here to me that's kind of difficult to represent. If we're thinking about fewer of them, how many do we have now? How do I represent that symbolically? So I guess initially it was just showing that there are plants and animals, and then this pool led to a kind of slow decrease down into the depths, which it's a little foreboding. The older population represented here visually, kind of reflecting a generation from before, generation that's coming, and the infinity of generations to come. And the wealth gap is fascinating from the point of view of nature, where we're looking at something like a city. This is like a skyline with rain falling. But this also sort of reminded me of a skyline, but maybe if you thought about it in terms of grass. And as an artist, like I start to see patterns and I see, oh, this grass could also be green, represents money. And the space between one area and another could represent a group of people. It's just the sort of abstract way I think. And as I started playing in this way, I got a little further into the idea of, well, what are the unifying metaphors or analogies that kind of help us understand all the concepts that the committees were managing. I had somebody translate all of the committee's ideas into post-its. on this virtual board and virtual post-its. These big grids in yellow, purple, red, orange, and so on are representing the groups that you might be familiar with, committees in the public health, um, water resources, arts and culture, youth design, public safety. You can see there's a lot of ideas, and that was really overwhelming to me, and I'm sure to everyone else. They're all not only multiple post-its, but many very sort of dense, even though they're trying to be concise. And, I admire the concise nature of a lot of these post-its. They do fit on a post-it. There is a very overwhelming quality to trying to say, where are the gaps, what's the significance, and where are the connections? So my saving grace was to kind of tap into almost a poetic sensibility. One post-it kind of made me realize there is a lot of reference to homelessness. There's a lot of reference to habitat, and there's a lot of representation of different communities, indigenous communities, communities of color, aging populations. And so as I thought about that, it really kind of was represented by the idea of what is home, where do we belong, and what is place? And you can see this is not exhaustive, but you see how quickly that connected to a lot of different committees' ideas. So embedding accessibility as a fundamental aspect of our design, dedicating staff to housing and homelessness, partnering with social service providers to serve people with mental health issues, and assess existing space needs and requirements at recreation centers for high use programs. So it's all, even just the ideas of space. But quickly we can also see like how things like water could affect space and ecology could affect space. So we start thinking about natural spaces, and I get quickly overwhelmed again, right? Even as I hesitate, I realize the reason is I almost don't know where to start first. And I assume there's some of that going on for any of you watching this too. So I'll go through all the categories I kind of landed on. Justice and voice, and this concept of balance, those seem very related and led to a lot of other ideas. And I'm trying to choose words that are unifying. They help us unite around our ideas rather than divide into the policies that we're holding on to very dearly. And getting very poetic, concepts of beauty are really fascinating when you're dealing with natural spaces, when you're dealing with humanity, spiritual concepts, even mathematics. I've talked about math with some really fascinating mathematicians that start to say, we know we're solving the problem more likely when it becomes beautiful. Take it or leave it. Play, of course, when we're talking about parks. But that made me really think too about the flow state, a little bit more of a psychological concept of play where the flow state is just healing. It helps us access our true nature, or something that at least represents a kind of loss of the analytical mind for a moment, to tap into a spirit of ourselves that connects to others more quickly and easily. Flow, of course, though, psychologically could also be looked at quite physically speaking in the case of water. And I'm not surprised I landed on something that's very elemental. Like elements when my work are usually very useful. They just help us kind of see where we're starting from. Everything does come back to water. And I think there's no surprise that another category was air and breath. But I found some interesting post-its that even helped me think of celebration. And so this one, recognize the parks as a unique canvas venue voice for celebrating the creative sector. So hooray, I'm part of that. What do you call it? Call me part of a sector, I'm not sure, but I feel creative, and most of us are. I think all of us want to be more creative, and to me, creativity is connect quite intensely to just very big concepts like what is life, what is giving, And the canopy in a park, I think, is really beautiful. It's a very helpful metaphor for how does an ecosystem work. It kind of floats above in a beautiful way. It also very quickly represents how much breath and air we have. Water also made me remember the delta, the importance of the delta in Minnesota. But the metaphor of the delta felt really useful from the point of view of how do we communicate? Like, where is our starting point? Where does that flow? And what does that lead in terms of channels to other things? Marketing and sales often are even described as channels. And it's pretty funny when we talk about channels in sales and marketing, we don't think about how they relate to water and they relate to natural spaces. And tributaries to me are just basically anything that might come from that. So as soon as we start communicating, we're talking about stories. And when we talk about beings, like human beings or other kinds of beings, we also think very quickly about what are the stories we tell, what are the stories that the indigenous people who are, are kind of the people that had this storytelling history and oral history before us, what stories would they tell about this land that we are now occupying, that we now colonized? How does that tie us back to something that we can all still share and unify around? How is that tied to something sacred? And this quickly all brings everything into a world where communicating and marketing is very quickly tied back to the beings that we're talking about and referring to and the stories we tell about them. When we talked about things like data and finances, I had the most trouble until I kind of figured out a metaphor around how it is that we tend to collect data, similarly to how we might collect stories, to collect actual physical things from the land. I think of seashells, I think of rocks, I think of stones. But rain collects. We think about gathering together like we would at a park. We can also think about gathering resources, and resources could be financial, but resources can be natural. This again is how data and decision making can tie back to something as universal as our natural resources. And the last one, but by no means the only ones total, this is just kind of where I am at this point. It could go on forever. This concept of trying to figure out how learning and education fits into our policy making, and trying to think about that, maybe think about concepts of like generating power, generating ideas. Precipitating is a nice thought about the way even water relates to that same root word. Kindling, concepts of fire, and another elemental idea also represents generational transition. So if I zoom out now before I get too much into my own stories, you can kind of see the way these interweave. So there's no trouble understanding there's connections to be had. I went back into and sort of created some images around some really common stories that were emerging in the policies. So public health, resilience, some of these are placed somewhat near ideas that I had as well. How to represent all of them. Partnership, something is pushed, something is pulled. Implementing, kind of related very quickly back to the river, the idea of a barge moving down the river. It doesn't always have to be fast. And it can carry quite a bit of information, quite a bit of resources. Currently, we're talking so much about justice for George Floyd and I Can't Breathe, Black Lives Matter. What does it look like to rise up? I put this, there's no accident, I put it by breath, put it by air. How we really forget very quickly these elemental things are deeply related to diversity and to justice and to the way we use our voices. Now, it's pretty hard to say that justice and voice has to be in the upper right, and fostering and celebrating in the lower level. So is important to remember this is part of a circle, and the circle to me isn't just because it fits beautifully, but because it is infinite. It's impossible to really say where it begins and ends. When you're dealing with a graphic space, you are stuck with the flat space. I'm doing my best to show there's layers here, there's things in front, there's things behind, and intentionally letting words like this that are a lot more analytical live a little bit back and quieter than some of these bigger archetypes of life. Natural space, nature is everywhere. Um, COVID, some of the other things I represented visually, stacked functions. The biggest thing that came to life for me in terms of significance was the way so many of these policy ideas wove into a pretty tight center around home and belonging. So I will kind of end here where I began. There's a if there's an analogy I think we might be able to unify around, it would be this one. There's many ways we have to look at this, so it won't be the only one. If there were a goal in the end, I didn't know it in the beginning, but it was to try to find language that allowed us to unify. There really won't be another way to do any of the goals we're trying to reach. We won't be able to reach them without some ideas around unifying. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave it. And there's a lot left. We may engage this again, we may not, but it's not that we won't engage all the policy ideas. Hopefully what we can do is bring this back to life sometime and continue to expand it and explore it and see where some of these pieces can fit in and how that might lead to more patterns similar to the one we're seeing here. So thanks so much for listening. And if you have any questions, contact us directly. My company is More Belief, and that's on the web. And you can reach out to me directly or reach out to the Parks Board. And hopefully we can just continue to keep this dialogue open. And so thanks for listening and paying attention today. I look forward to seeing what comes next.